Welcome to the Numerical Tarot, a new tarot paradigm, an alternative to tradition, an axial system of archetypal crystallography, a trans-culturally anthropomorphized, life-biased binary influence calculator, a wisdom system, an archetype enhancer, with harmony of interpretation throughout. The content of all the videos in this series are excerpts, edits and brief summaries from the eBooks All Things Are Numbers and All Things Are Patterns, links below. For a more complete explanation of each idea, additional reading might be helpful. Hopefully the basic ideas come across enough to pique your interest in trying this alternative approach to tarot. For this video, and all the tarot videos in this series, I would have liked to include images from the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot deck, being that it is one of the most popular decks out there, from which many clones are made. But when examining the criteria for fair use, the condition of whether or not my use might impact future success or market value of the original might be held against me, as I am definitely promoting an alternative that I would like to see supplant previous decks as a new paradigm. In fact, I would like nothing more than to see artists making clones from the ideas and imagery of the Numerical Tarot deck and its underlying structure, completely surpassing the Rider-Waite-Smith deck in that way. So throughout these videos I have not used their imagery. That is unfortunate in this particular video, where I would like to make detailed comparisons between decks. But written descriptions will have to do, and hopefully not get me in trouble. I suggest looking up each Rider-Waite-Smith card online as it is brought up for comparison. Wikipedia has an easy-to-navigate presentation, linked below. It would be better if the cards were laid out in the same way as my deck, but you're not likely to find that anywhere. This video is going to compare the Numerical Tarot deck to the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot deck. You may have noticed that the title of this video is called Wrong, because, most assuredly, many who are devoted to the Rider-Waite-Smith deck and all forms of more traditional tarot will look at the differences between these decks and instinctively declare my changes to be downright wrong. And from their perspective, that is completely correct. Of course, from my perspective, I could also declare, and essentially have declared, the imagery of decks like Rider-Waite-Smith to be wrong, or the result of a more logical game design being corrupted by the syncretism of occultism smushing together belief systems that were never meant to be associated with each other or a tarot deck in the first place, creating a result that is objectively wrong to any original intent. So, what about these decks? The Rider-Waite Tarot deck, illustrated by Pamela Colman Smith, is one of the most popular decks ever. An astounding number of artists draw from the images of this one deck to create infinite variations of their own. In many ways it has become the de facto standard to which many other decks are compared. But it is not the first deck ever drawn. It is an interpretation of tarot, born out of the mind of Arthur Edward Waite and Pamela Colman Smith. Their ideas evolved from the influence of the occult, and the occult societies of their time. The occultists came up with many inventive ideas to breathe life into the images of tarot, always, it would seem, with the idea that tarot was more than just a game. As a game, older decks appeared to use a design that included a more logical structure than what is seen in later decks like Rider-Waite-Smith. It is the belief of this study of tarot that the influence of occult societies, devoted, as they are, to the study and perpetuation of mysteries, has pulled the underlying structure of tarot away from its logical game-like roots. With this in mind, the Numerical Tarot puts itself out there as an alternative that does what it can to step away from the occult world of mysticism and approach the symbolism of tarot in a whole new way. By abandoning the mystical rhetoric of occult societies, the Numerical Tarot attempts to recreate a more logical, common-sense, game-like structure to the underlying design of the deck. Most people assume that Mr. Waite and Ms. Smith were probably influenced heavily by the ideas of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, being that they were both members. From this speculation we can guess that at least some of the illustrations of the minor arcana were meant to illustrate those Golden Dawn attributes and their descriptive titles. But others have also speculated that Mr. Waite had in his possession another, secret document, whose identity was never revealed. This, then, might explain why the Rider-Waite-Smith deck does not conform exactly to the specifications of a true Golden Dawn design. In addition, we can also speculate about other blended influences that might have influenced Mr. Waite's instructions, or Ms. Smith's artistic license. If Mr. Waite and Ms. Smith did use the ideas of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn as a major influence, then it is obvious that interpretations from the numerical tarot will have no bearing whatsoever on what was intended by those authors. But, at the same time, it is interesting how easily the structure of the numerical tarot could be illustrated by the imagery of a completely unrelated deck, when the two were compared side by side. What, if anything, does that ultimately mean? Does it mean that Mr. Waite, Ms. Smith, the Golden Dawn, and I, were all tapping into the same archetypal blueprint when composing our imagery? Maybe. What is that blueprint? Is it Kabbalah-based? Is it astrology-based? Is it alchemy-based? Is it the theoretical model of existence being put forth everywhere in this study? Who knows? It may never be known. But I would encourage devotees of the Rider-Waite-Smith deck to explore this alternative view before deciding what is really what. Before you watch this video though, you really should familiarize yourself with the drawings of my deck and the way I lay out my deck, as described in all the videos previous to this one. Because the numerical tarot makes several changes to the layout of a traditional tarot deck, especially when compared to the way most people lay out the popular Rider-Waite-Smith tarot deck. At the same time though, it is fascinating to see how the prescribed meanings for each card do not change all that much from one deck to the other. However, there are a few places where significant changes do take place. It is the wish of the numerical tarot that viewers and users of this deck will see these few instances, where significant changes occur, as improvements rather than mistakes or violations of some tarot tradition that cannot be questioned or changed. Tarot has evolved in the past. This is another suggested path of evolution. Did the creators of the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot have this configuration in mind when they designed their deck? Was it accidentally carried over, as a relic, from an adapted or copied deck of old, and then lost among the changes made by the application of occultism? This video asks you to lay out your Rider-Waite-Smith deck the same way as the numerical tarot deck and look at these suggested relationships. Not all of them will make sense, because of how the Rider-Waite-Smith deck obviously differs in some spots. But in quite a few places, and in quite a few ways, this layout fits the Rider-Waite-Smith deck quite well. It is the wish of the numerical tarot that the viewers and users of this deck will see this layout as more organized and sensible, and view the places where the Rider-Waite-Smith deck doesn't fit, as falling short of this more sensible, and easier to learn array of ideas. So, when comparing the Rider-Waite-Smith deck to the numerical tarot deck, try looking at the Rider-Waite-Smith deck through these numerical tarot eyes, rather than looking at the numerical tarot through Rider-Waite-Smith eyes, and see if you can see the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot differently. You may end up wishing the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot, and all of its many clones, could be changed to fit this new paradigm more perfectly than they do. If you are an artist, do that. Draw a deck that uses as many of the existing images of the Rider-Waite-Smith as possible, while changing those few cards that don't fit this new template into something that does. A collaboration would be welcome. Here's what to look for when comparing these two decks. A. Equidistant similarities. With the major arcana altered into 2 rows of 9, with 4 left over, and the 10s of the minor arcana removed, try looking for symmetry between the left and right side of each row of 9. Look at the 2 and 8 of swords. Consider the similarities between the magician and the hermit. Consider the similarities between the hanged man and the tower. B. Life and death opposites. With the major arcana altered into 2 rows of 9, try to think of the 2 rows as positive and negative paths of a life and death cycle. Try to step away from putting a positive spin on every single card. Look for positive and negative similarities between cards of the same number, where 2-digit numbers are reduced to 1. Look at the lovers, a 6, and the devil, also a 6. Try to also think of the minor arcana as 2 rows of positive cards, and 2 rows of negative cards, just like the early playing card decks that came before tarot. Then, look for each row of cards to be consistently positive or negative all the way across. Take note of when and where the Rider-Waite-Smith deck is not consistently positive or negative all the way across a suit. C. Parent-to-child relationships. With the majors and minors both reduced to rows of 9, and both seen as positive and negative, try viewing the positive and negative cards of the majors as parents to the positive and negative cards of the minors, which would then be the children of those major parents, i.e., 2 children in the minors for every 1 parent in the majors. Look at Justice and the 2 of Swords. Look at the Empress and the 3 of Cups versus the Hanged Man and the 3 of Swords. Look at Strength and the 8 of Coins versus The star and the 8 of staves. D. Left brain or right brain perceptions. With the minors as 2 rows positive and 2 rows negative, try viewing the suit of coins and staves as more physical, conscious or left-brained analytical, and the suits of cup and swords as more emotional, subconscious or right-brained holistic. Try viewing coins and staves as something happening, and cups and swords as the emotional equivalent across positive and negative possibilities. Then, try making comparisons between cards of the same number in what are now opposing suits of coins versus staves and cups versus swords. Look at the 3 of cups versus the 3 of swords. Look at the 2 of cups versus the 2 of swords. Look at the 8 of coins versus the 8 of staves. Look at the 2 of coins versus the 2 of staves. Look at the 9 of coins versus the 9 of staves. E. A 4x1 array. With the majors split into 2 rows of 9, with 4 left over, try to think of those last 4 as a quaternary, representing the 4 stages of the theoretical model of existence upon which the numerical tarot is based, or any number of other sacred quaternaries from other systems of belief. Think of these 4 as the parents of the major arcana, where the first 4 or last 4 cards of either row of 9 correspond to these 4 quaternary cards. Compare the world to the Hermit. Compare the Sun to the Empress. Compare judgment to strength. F. A 4x4 array. With everything being thought of as rows of 9 or a quaternary of 4, try viewing the court cards as a row of 9 that has been folded at the number 5, so that the numbers 1, 2, 3 and 4 are crossed like a grid against the numbers 6, 7, 8 and 9. Superimpose the 1, 2, 3 and 4 of each suit, a 4x4 grid, over the 4x4 grid of the court cards. Then, take the 6, 7, 8 and 9 of each suit, another 4x4 grid, turn that grid 90 degrees clockwise and superimpose that as well. Look for these combined, hybrid influences in the character of each court card icon. Beginning the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, is the card labeled the Magician. From the perspective of the numerical tarot, the magician's mental agility and sleight of hand dexterity symbolize the concept of speed associated to the number 1 in the geometric progression, described in a previous video. As a true magician though, he does not perform tricks, but instead displays a superior intellect and willpower. His knowledge, awareness and mastery of earthly manifestations is symbolized by the 4 suit signs of the minor suits, placed on the table in front of him, the ordered system of tarot. At his best, the magician symbolizes the brain, the mind, the intellect and the propitious state of pre-ameliorate incipiency. At his worst, he is too smart for his own good. Opposite the magician we have the Wheel of Fortune card. In the Wheel of Fortune card we see the concept of cycles being symbolized, and convey the notion of the number 1 as the eternal beginning without beginning. In comparing these cards to each other, we see how they both represent the 2 sides of divine mechanics, order and randomness. Both cards also represent a beginning. The magician symbolizes the awareness of a deliberate beginning and the ability to make things happen, while the Wheel of Fortune symbolizes the randomness of a beginning that does not have this awareness and is therefore associated with fate. In fact, in some decks, the Wheel of Fortune card is labeled fate. The Wheel of Fortune symbolizes the outer reaches of one's karmic forces, before they return to their source. Of course that fate can be good or bad, the point is, it's beyond your control, you let it happen. You spin the Wheel of Fortune and take whatever you get, while the magician on the other hand, makes a conscious attempt to make things happen. So the magician can be willful at best or pompous at worst. While the wheel card symbolizes someone who is harmlessly naive and innocent at best, and stupid and ignorant at worst. In pre-occult decks, the magician is sometimes called the mountebank, and described in unflattering ways like swindler or trickster. The point being to describe him as a lowly commoner, and not a magician. His low social status then marks him as the lowest of all the major icons. But whether a dishonest, swindling mountebank, or benevolent magician, both live off their wits and intellect being a key concept for the number 1. So, even as a con man, the idea of superior intellect, or thinking, talking and being fast is important. A con man has to be smarter than those he is swindling. In pre-occult decks, the Wheel of Fortune seems to emphasize the idea of folly, and the foolishness of ambition, showing characters ascending the wheel and growing ass ears to symbolize the stupidity of thinking their will can reign, and then falling off the other side, to symbolize the fickle, random nature of fate that can so easily defeat all will. By seeing this card as a 1, it becomes a symbol of a turn of fate that is diametrically opposite in purpose to that of the magician, and thereby marks the beginning of a deteriorate progression of ideas. In the seasonal tarot deck, white bark birch trees, a rose bush, a mountain in the distance, a man with legs together and arms crossed, looking up, like a numeral 1. Magic wand, opposed by a woman in same pose. Random cards falling. In the isomorphic tarot deck, the symbol of a magician remains intact, being titled auspice, the cognizant genius. While on the other side I choose to humanize the concepts of ignorance, stupidity and falling into the hands of fate with the image of a fool, titling this card Portent, the ignorant fool. Of course this means that the current fool of the tarot deck, numbered 0, is now considered to be superfluous and in need of a new identity. In the numerical tarot deck, we see a jinni from a lamp giving the spark of life to a fetus. We see the finger of a genius making a point. The sun is rising on a new day. A swift flies by. Spring flowers are in bloom. He is opposed by a jinx, sticking pins in a voodoo doll to change someone's fate to something worse. We see the finger of an idiot with the goop of something that should not have been touched. Cards are randomly flying by. Pandora's box is open on the ground, releasing evil. These two cards are probably one of the most obvious pair of correlating symbols that result from altering the 22 majors into 2 rows of 9. Both have a woman between 2 pillars, with a fabric draped behind them. Both cards represent the number 2 in the balance and flux of opposites, as well as the vision of direction that tells us where the preceding one will go. As we examine the High Priestess though, we encounter an icon that seems a bit misplaced when viewed against the balance, symmetry, contrast and consistency of the grid matrix used in the numerical tarot. Covered in veils, with the sacred scriptures of the Torah in her lap, the High Priestess usually symbolizes the concept of mystery and occultism, holding the secret laws for a secret church, or sitting before the Temple of Solomon as a veil in front of that wealth of wisdom. Unfortunately, in our system, such forms of mystery and occultation connect her with the concept of obfuscation, and so, the negative side of our grid matrix of interrelated ideas. That would make her misplaced. On the other hand, to some, she is also responsible for the idea of revealing her mysteries, as the waxing moon at her feet symbolizes, so we must also consider her connected to the idea of inspiration. Because of this we see how this one card actually pulls ideas from both halves of our matrix, making her placement at the very least, a bit imprecise. In the Zohar, the Torah is compared to an inspiration, or an inspiring vision that is only glanced for a moment, but lasts for a lifetime. Some describe the veils of occultation seen in the High Priestess card as hiding the light of the divine within. Perhaps these positive qualities of inspiration are why this icon is used in this position, who knows? Personally I believe that mystery, revealed or not, remains intrinsically mysterious and so belongs on the negative side of our major icons. Unfortunately, in the drawings of my deck, I only illustrate the bad side of the negative cards. That means that the High Priestess icon, with all her darkness, veils, occultation and mystery, is no longer usable as an illustrated icon in my deck. She still exists as an unillustrated icon, the reverse of a negative 2, but not as an illustrated icon. Disappointing, yes, but unavoidable if we are to adhere to a balanced, symmetrical, contrasting and consistent design, rooted in patterns in nature, organized upon a matrix of interrelated ideas, capable of revealing the cumulative effects of the binary nature of our universe upon an individual. At this point, people devoted to the High Priestess symbol might well question the usefulness of this matrix idea, and all the logic that led to its creation, as a way of arguing for the preservation of this attractive symbol. To those people I can only suggest that the High Priestess be thought of as a symbol of inspiration, and not mystery, and be drawn in a less mysterious, less dark and less veiled way. In early decks, this card is called the Papess, a female equivalent to the Hierophant who, in early decks, is called the Pope. Some have suggested that the image of a female pope, who is actually dressed more like a nun, might have supplanted the missing virtue of prudence, or perhaps faith. If this were so, a Papess would be a much more appropriate symbol for a positive 2 than a woman of mystery. Prudence would also be much more appropriate for a positive 2, as prudence, who some consider the most important of the cardinal virtues, gives us the foresight, and points the way to the virtuous path that leads to the other virtues that are depicted elsewhere in the deck. At her best the High Priestess, or Papess, or Prudence, would, or should, represent a clear path to understanding, and virtue, and the emergence of ideas from nowhere, via the spark of the magician. At her worst, she would be an impenetrable smokescreen, blocking your vision, like the fabric behind her. She would foil your navigational equipment and paralyze you, making you wait for the fog to lift, making her more appropriate to the bad side of a deteriorate too. My own subjective view of good and bad, coming through there, of course. Across from the High Priestess, we have the figure of Justice, obviously symbolizing the idea of balance and opposition. However, once again, it's difficult to tell whether she is revealing the good or bad side of these concepts, subjectively speaking, and whether she is properly located with respect to positive or negative influence on our matrix. Both the ameliorate and deteriorate sides of the majors express the idea of balance. The difference between these two sides is between the open parallel balance that leads to immediate and direct action and clear lines of sight, versus the closed and crossed balance that leads to intermittent and direct, or frustrated action or obscured lines of sight. The pillars, sword, balanced scales and unblinded eyes indicate to me a leaning toward the open and parallel, which would of course make this card misplaced. Perhaps this card is suggesting a need for open parallel balance in the face of crossed antagonistic balance. In any case, I feel a need for clarification, so. In the seasonal tarot deck, we see a woman in purple dress, a joyful pose that resembles the funnel part of the funnel tunnel maze diagram. An arrow launching, the arrow of time, opposed by a purple-dressed woman hiding her face with arms resembling scales of justice. Scales of justice balancing. In the isomorphic tarot deck, I choose to eliminate both of these icons. On the ameliorate side, I replace the High Priestess with a symbol of an unquestionably inspired, or inspiring person, having absolute clear vision over an immediate and direct path. I title the card Inspiration, the animated visionary. While on the other side, the bad, negative, deteriorate too is symbolized by a blinded, frustrated lost soul on a crooked path full of obstacles. I title the card Obfuscation, the frustrated waif. At its best, the ameliorate too restates the idea of inspiration in a clear path to understanding. While at its worst it represents the idea of missing the obvious. On the other side, the negative too shows us the idea of obfuscation and wandering around in a fog. While at its best it restates the idea of mystery and a meandering path. The High Priestess, keeper of mysteries, would be associated with the good side of a negative too. I don't illustrate the good of the negative too, but the concepts embodied by Woman of Mystery remains intact within this system of balanced, symmetrical, and contrasting ideas. In the numerical tarot deck, we see a muse pointing the way of inspiration. She is on a clear and direct path of motion leading to an open gate. In the distance, a ship is navigating. We see the hand of that visionary navigator, holding a telescope. Geese fly by. A bee is making a beeline of immediate and direct motion. Spring tulips open. She is opposed by a mysterious haunt casting a pall with her cloak. We see the hand of a waif tangled in cobwebs. We see a fly also caught in her web. She is on a crooked path leading to closed gates. The Empress is taken by many to be the symbol of all that is yin and female. However, elsewhere within this Rider-Waite Smith versus Numerical Tarot comparison, and elsewhere in this study, we point out how the number 6, the Lovers, holds the place of equidistant opposition to that of the Emperor's yang forces. When arranged as 2 rows of 9 the Numerical Tarot way, the Empress and the Hanged Man both share the number 3 on the number line. As such, the Empress is seen as the positive embodiment of all that is 3. In symbolizing the number 3, we can observe how she perfectly expresses the abstract idea of a surface or skin around a theoretical model of existence, with her external beauty, her smooth and perfect skin, as well as her association to nature. She also expresses the creative side of an ameliorate number lines 1, 2, 3 trinity, with her perfection and grace. While the aspens and wheat around her symbolize her gentle touch as they sway gracefully in the breeze that caresses her. Her cushions symbolize the comfort of a perfect life, while the pomegranates on her dress symbolize the blood of life contained by her surface skin. At her best, the Empress is a perfect expression of the hand of God, beautiful inside and out. She is a pure and perfect, smooth and sensitive form. At her worst, she becomes too sensitive, too fragile and too obsessed with physical perfection, an impossibility of her finite condition. The Empress has thin skin, in both good and bad ways. The Hanged Man, on the other hand, is the beast to the beauty of the Empress. In fact, in making the Beauty and the Beast comparison, we could even go so far as to label the hanged man as an antichrist, and symbolize that with the inversion of a crucifix, thus creating the hanged man symbol. A crucifix is a symbol for physical, emotional, and spiritual suffering. Suffering occurs when our physical or emotional skin is in pain. The hanged man represents a trauma to a surface, or the presence of a surface which produces a trauma. He represents a corporeal form that is rough and crudely fashioned, an abomination. Comparison has been made between the hanged man and the image of hell as seen on a fresco in the Basilica of San Petronio, giving me the suggestion that this card was perhaps originally intended to portray extreme pain and suffering. To me, it is a card of pain and suffering whether received or given. In early decks, this card is titled The Traitor. Gertrude Moakley suggested that it might be a representation of a shame painting, posted on walls of a jail to identify escaped criminals. Criminals, or traitors, are people who are usually hated by the law-abiding public. As an act of hatred, Mussolini was hung upside down, after being overthrown. In the Bible, a hanged man is cursed by God, Deuteronomy 21:22-23. Many identify the structure around the hanged man as a gibbet, an instrument for executing the condemned. Sometimes the condemned were drawn and quartered like an animal. This is a card of killing, or being killed. It's a card of hate or being hated. The diametrical opposite of the Empress, who is all about love and being loved. The Empress is the embodiment of love, while the purpose of a gibbet is to encourage public scorn, ridicule and hate. The Empress is about comfort. The hanged man is about pain. At his worst, the hanged man is everything the Empress isn't. He is ugly and grotesque, crude and uncouth, rough and clumsy, a profane godless beast, perhaps even a killer. At his best, he represents a person making a painful sacrifice, a rugged, rustic outdoorsy nature lover, who lives an ascetic life with animals, as an animal. As a person making a painful sacrifice, the image of Judas fits this position. While still a bit severe, the idea of pain and killing are intact, but in a way that indicates a willing, or at least necessary sacrifice. In the seasonal tarot deck, we see a crude and sloppy-looking man looking at clenched, clumsy fingers. Animal in background. Dagger-piercing hand causing pain. On the positive side, a woman in a red dress looking at her manicured fingers. Touching a rose. In the isomorphic tarot deck, because I choose to illustrate my own subjective sense of bad in the negative deteriorative cards, the hanged man is not only not hanging, but is symbolized by a much more savage-looking creature, hovering over the bones of his many murdered victims, both animal and human. See my description of Death card for his next, feeble victim. I title the card Abomination, the Vicious Beast. On the other side, I again forego the notion of royalty, see Emperor card, and simply think of the good, ameliorate three of the majors as a representation of the most beautiful creature on earth, a goddess. Or if you prefer, you could substitute an Adonis in this position. I title the card Adoration, the Winsome Beauty. In the Numerical tarot deck, we see a tropical beauty from the islands, smelling a beautiful flower. We see the hand of an artist, who wants to draw her form to perfection. Lush vegetation of nature is all around. There is a smooth leaf. She is opposed by a vicious, writhing beast, and the hand of a slob making ugly scratch marks. Prickly thorns are all around. There is a prickly leaf. In the distance a pig is being slaughtered on a gibbet. If the major icons of tarot were symmetrically designed, the Emperor would be considered the husband to the feminine forces of the equidistant six. A concept that would be obvious if the major icons were viewed as two sets of 9, as they are, within the numerical tarot. As part of a 1 through 9 progression, the Emperor symbolizes to us the beginning of the substantive mass of existence, and the process of building the three dimensions of reality, as described in a previous video. This idea of beginning a process of building at the number 4 makes this card important to the ideas of commitment, foundation and ambition. In the sexual progression, seen elsewhere in this study, the number 4 represented foreplay and the establishment of sexual readiness. In the creativity progression, it represented the preparation and research necessary for a successful intellectual or imaginative conclusion. Both of these abstract progressions showed the need for a strong foundation to be established at the number 4 before proceeding to the build-up of the equidistant 6. Strength, power, discipline, guidance and all these masculine, yang characteristics are all poured into this one symbol of an emperor. On the number line, the power of the number 2 was described as immediate and direct, i.e. the path of least distance, while the power of the number 4 was described as optional and open to suggestion, i.e., the path of least resistance. In the dimensional language model, the number 4 was allowed to progress in any direction. But while this remained an option or choice, the decision to continue the progression itself was not considered optional, but mandatory and eventual or inevitable, due to the peristaltic, reverse entropy, nature of 1 through 9 progressions. The optional energy of the Emperor card symbolizes the strength and discipline required to meet the demands of penetrating and finding one's way through a 4-5-6 cluster, maze or mass of coagulated existence. Symbolic of work itself, this seemingly optional but still mandatory and eventual process means that with courage and fortitude, a path through life will be forged. Thus, the stronger the Emperor, the stronger the results of the whole numerical progression. At its best, the Emperor is a Superman, strong, aggressive, stable and bearing. While at his worst, he is a greedy workaholic whose empire is never big enough, over-aggressive and overbearing, a person who sees everyone around him as lazy, a bully. Opposite the Emperor is the card titled Death, probably the most misunderstood card of any deck, and not nearly as ominous as many think when they see it appear in a reading. The card of Death symbolizes the destructive death of an entity or event. The two pillars in the distance come from the card labeled the Moon, which is the destination Death is heading for. To the numerical tarot, the Moon is the card of actual death, or endings. Thus, the Death card symbolizes the changes that occur along a path toward this goal. Seeing the Death card as an opposite to the Emperor is not easy. Perhaps if the card were labeled Mr. Death, we could relate to it as more of a human entity with motives opposite to that of Mr. Emperor. Then we would be able to see how the Emperor's ameliorate characteristics of strength, power, discipline, guidance and building of a mass of existence becomes inverted or deteriorative. If we saw things that way, we would see how the Emperor represents welcome ameliorate changes that promote stability and build toward a happy ending, while Mr. Death would represent the catastrophic changes that destroy all hope, create instability, and lead to an eventual demise. At card 9, the Moon. At its worst, the Death card represents unnecessary destruction, like the ravages of war or senseless crimes. It also represents weakness, and behavior that leads to unwanted changes, i.e., a weak commitment, that leads to a compromised foundation, that leads to the dubious and unpredictable future that we see depicted in the equidistant 6, the Devil. At its best, the Death card represents necessary destruction, like clearing away that which is old and in the way for something new and better, the predecessor to the double-edged sword of progress, in card 6. The religious figure that falls before death shows how these winds of change affect everyone. While the other people falling in the path of Mr. Death represent those who are afraid, weak and without guidance, easy prey for destructive forces. When combined with its equidistant partner, the Devil, the Death card represents the vulnerability of man that leads to the decadence of a 6. Finally, we see how the concept of death or dying also carries with it the mandatory and eventual characteristics of any 4-5-6 progression, as death becomes an inevitable function of all things. So the Emperor builds, and death destroys. Mr. Death is cutting down everything in his path, whether that is good or bad depends on your point of view. If you can accept change, you will survive, and the unpredictable aspects of the equidistant 6 will be seen as an undetermined future of opportunities rather than a dubious conjecture of doubt that causes you to fall prey to your own fears. At this point, the vulnerability of the number 4 becomes another double-edged sword of good and bad influence. In the seasonal tarot deck, we see a strong, handsome man. Orb of royalty, opposed by the skeleton of death with waterfall in background. A scythe. In the isomorphic tarot deck, I make a slight alteration with regard to the Emperor, and a big change to the Death card. In my deck, I choose to relegate cards of royalty to the court cards. Because of this, my Emperor card is no longer portrayed as a true Emperor, but is instead illustrated with the more generic image of a strong man. As a strong man, this icon could still be considered royalty if one prefers, or he could be considered a soldier, or as I prefer, just a strong person. I use a man for this symbol because the number 4 is considered the yang, opposite to the altruistic angel in my Lovers card. I title the card Benevolence, the Mighty Hero. Because I see the number 9 as the true card of literal death, I choose to illustrate the Death card with an image that opposes the strong man image. Thus my Death card is altered into that of a weak person being dragged down like wild prey on the plains of Africa by a serpent from hell. I title the card Malevolence, the Feeble Victim. In the Numerical Tarot deck, we see a kingly type, with building materials and equipment. He also has a weapon for protection of himself and others. We see the hand of a valiant, holding a nail, waiting to help build. A wall is under construction. His foot is on the cornerstone. There is a strong link. Mountains of solid rock are in the distance. He is opposed by a destructive villain with club and fire. Her foot is on the burned-out stump of a cut-down tree. Everything is on fire. We see the hand of a victim grabbing a branch that breaks off. In the distance, a volcano is erupting with fire. There is a weak link. As representations of the number 5, both the Hierophant and Temperance represent the ideas of in-betweenness, and the midpoint of the 1 through 9 number line being presented everywhere in this study, as well as the nucleus of our spherically equivalent model. In both cases, the number 5 position was described as a neutral or pivotal point of confluence between fundamental opposites as they converged and diverged, or imploded and exploded. Thus union and exchange become keywords to build upon for both these cards. We have also seen how the number 5 becomes a kind of glue or binding force, marrying the two sides of our number line. The Hierophant is a perfect representation of this very idea. Sometimes labeled the Pope, he is in fact the binding force at the midpoint of the ameliorate side of the majors. As suggested elsewhere within this analysis, if this deck were laid out symmetrically, he would in fact be seen as holding the 4 and 6 together, like a priest at a wedding, standing in the middle and holding a man and a woman together in holy matrimony. When viewed symmetrically, as the midpoint of a 1 through 9 progression, the Hierophant shows how a firm foundation, Emperor 4, with successful negotiations, Hierophant 5, can lead to a happy union, Lovers 6, 4, 5, 6. To the Numerical Tarot, the monks standing before the Hierophant represent the idea of opposites converging upon an infinite in-between, as they attempt to behold the secrets that lie within this mysterious point of singularity. But, paradoxically, we find that both of these monks cannot occupy the Hierophant's attention at the same time, and so we find that the Hierophant must alternate his influence between them, thus creating the alternation that leads to the endless fluctuations and undulations of life's pulse. The Hierophant must also ensure that a cooperative, orderly, and temperate state prevails between all fluctuating, undulating, converging and diverging opposites. Thus he is about total control. At his best, the Hierophant is a neutral mediator, serving the needs of opposing sides, like an elected official enforcing the law of the land. At its worst, he is a controlling force that dictates the needs of opposing sides with oppressive rules, regulations and government. To the Numerical Tarot, the two keys that some decks include in the Hierophant card are the keys of the absentia, the two pole points of paradox that limit and contain all human thought and consciousness, a concept we have not yet covered in these videos, but will. One point of paradoxical absentia lies at the extreme outsides of our theoretical model of existence, the other at the infinite center, or in this case, midpoint. More on that later. In continuing, we move on to the card labeled Temperance. In viewing the majors as an unbroken path of 22 trumps, one might not readily perceive the connection between Temperance and the Hierophant, even though many decks do describe them both as neutral mediators. However, in the Numerical Tarot, this association is very clear. But alas, as we have expressed a preference for balance, symmetry, contrast and consistency, we cannot help but notice that temperance is a concept that has already been used in our description of the Hierophant. Indeed, if we look at the various models of existence seen everywhere in this study, we will see how the temperate core is used to describe the intangible attributes of the ameliorate 5. So within our matrix organization of ideas, we must now consider the card of Temperance as misplaced, and in doing so proceed to describe the characteristics that ought to occupy this space, as dictated by the precise organization of opposites upon a grid matrix of interrelated ideas. When approached this way, we could view Temperance as a correlative icon to the Hierophant, reinforcing the consonance that is his goal. But we cannot allow Temperance to remain part of the deteriorate side of the majors, as an expression of temperance itself. We could however choose to view this card not as an expression of temperance per se, but as an expression of a need for temperance. Temperance, being somewhat uniquely positive-looking within a row of somewhat negative-looking cards, could be viewed as being like the calm, temperate eye of a hurricane amid the swirling negativity on either side. But, in pursuing a continuity of positive and negative sides, we would have to say that such a position ought to represent something less than temperate, i.e., something intemperate. In viewing this card this way, It would show us how fear, death 4, and antagonistic arguments with no middle ground, temperance 5, or the need for temperance, will lead to distrust and an unhappy union, devil 6, 4, 5, 6. In this way, the card of temperance can remain an in-between to its equidistant neighbors of death and devil. At its best, temperance is just that, the suggestion to opposing sides to moderate their forces. At its worst, it represents a mediator who has no control whatsoever. Perhaps a better symbol for this card would be that of a boxing referee, a marriage counselor, or a police officer responding to a domestic disturbance. In the seasonal tarot deck, we see a scholarly-looking man with fancy cape and eagle in background over big mountain. Laws coming from a book. Opposed by a witchy-looking woman with deep canyon in background. Batwings and lightning bolt. In the isomorphic tarot deck, I attempt to combine the symbols of Hierophant and Temperance into one card with an image of temperance that emerges from a potion mixed by an alchemist. The alchemist symbolizes the tangible concepts of finite mixtures, orderly exchanges and a finite midpoint, while the angel of temperance symbolizes the intangible attributes of union and confluence. I title the card Consonance, the Affable Wizard. I then choose to replace the deteriorate 5 of the majors, temperance, with an image comparable to my alchemist, that of an evil witch, mixing a potion in a cauldron, with a winged demon emerging. Both creatures symbolize the trouble and anarchy that is the essence of a negative deteriorative 5 gone bad. I title the card Dissonance, the Recalcitrant Witch. In both of these cards, the emerging spirit of either angel or demon is carried on to the following cards to become the altruistic angel or sinister demon discussed in the lovers and devil part of this analysis. In the numerical tarot deck, we see an alchemistic wizard reading from a book of laws, while conjuring up an angel from the potion in the retort on his furnace. She is a medium. In the distance there is a mountain range, dividing the rainy side from the sunny side, putting us in the middle. A bird is eating out of a hand. He is opposed by an evil witch, mixing a potion that delivers a demon from a cauldron. He is a misfit. She stands on a spell-casting pentagram. A black cat arches its back. A bird is biting the hand that feeds it. In the distance we see canyon walls, putting us in the middle. Because each card of the majors is a combination of both tangible and intangible influences, symbolism needs to be very concise. In the case of the lovers and devil, we have our earthly, tangible man and woman, combined with the spiritual, intangible angel or devil. As we look for symbols in these cards that correlate to our keywords, we see how a spiritual angel represents the benevolent, altruistic, sustaining, reliable and predictable influence upon the man and woman. Likewise, in contrasting terms, we see how the devil represents the malevolent, sinister, detrimental, dubious and unpredictable influence of evil. The number for the lovers and devil is 6. As part of the 4-5-6 mass of existence that our number line attempts to describe, we can see how each couple represents the intercourse of opposites, as well as the reciprocity and integration that the apart-together model is known for. In other words, they both share parts of both. As this is so, we see how the couple in the Lovers card are in a productive and ameliorate interdependence, an honest, sharing relationship based in love and passion, beneficial and appreciating, in an abstract way, a growing mass. However, the couple in the Devil card are chained to an unproductive deteriorate interdependence that does not allow either an honest expression, detrimental and depreciating, in an abstract way, a crumbling mass. They are together out of lust and the loosely fitted chains around them represent their willing participation in this destructive destiny. To the numerical tarot, the pillar the devil stands on represents the destructive attachment some people have to their aggregate mass of possessions, both physical and emotional. While conversely the mountain in the distance, behind the lovers, represents the accumulation of a mass to be shared by all, an entity that cannot be possessed. When these cards are interpreted in their reversed, or upside-down state, we see their opposite good or bad side, subjectively speaking of course. In the case of the Lovers card we can see the dangers of total 100% honesty, while the devil represents the concept of necessary evil. Thus each card becomes a double-edged sword spanning a spectrum of possibilities. There are of course many other numerical attributes that we can attach to the number 6 that are not adequately symbolized in either card. For example, if this deck were to show equidistant similarities, the male figure of the lovers would be moved to card 4 and the female figure would remain in card 6 with the Hierophant between them, card 5, holding them together like a priest at a wedding. What this deck appears to be doing instead is showing more of a progression through to a state of marriage at the number 6. So instead of the Emperor, card 4, being married, by the Hierophant, card 5, to a female symbol at card 6, card 6 symbolizes the growth of a relationship to a state of beneficial sustaining consequence, marriage, in an abstract way, symbolic of the building up of the 4-5-6 mass of existence seen within our guiding model of patterns. If this deck were laid out in an equidistant and symmetrical manner, it would enable us to view the 6 as a maternal, feminine, receptive, wombish, yin sort of number. And the 4 as a paternal, masculine, penetrative, phallic, yang sort of number, and the 5 as the glue that holds the two sides of our number line together. Of course, back in the olden days, when the template of tarot was being created, it was an even more patriarchal world than it is today. Thus, many decks are depicted with a bias toward the hero's journey, as it relates to a male figure. This being so, it is not surprising to see our hero take a lover in card 6, instead of using card 6 to showcase the qualities of yin, femaleness. In the seasonal tarot deck, we see a blue-dressed woman with lots of jewelry. A diamond ring, opposed by a suspicious criminal-looking man. A satanic goat head. In the isomorphic tarot deck, I choose to follow an equidistant design, and proceed to change the lovers into a single icon that represents, to me, all the yin, maternal concepts just covered. I title the card Sustenance, the altruistic angel, and show a very maternal, angelic woman nursing an infant, to symbolize the sustaining nourishing environment, and wombish influence of the female side. On the bad side I retain the image of a devil, to oppose my angel, and repeat the image of an infant, only this time the infant is being molested by the devil, to symbolize the detrimental subversive environment of a bad negative 6. I title the card Decadence, the sinister demon. In the numerical tarot deck, we see the angel from the previous card, holding a baby up in the air. Her foot is on a treasure chest full of riches. We see the hand of a royal with one of those riches, a diamond ring. In the distance, fields of cord are also providing riches of another kind. A bundle of sticks wrapped tight are like the unbreakable bonds of family. She is opposed by the devil from the previous card, holding a baby upside down over a pit of hell. We see the hand of a reject after being cut off and discarded. A collection of sticks are not wrapped tight and can easily be broken. Disease-ridden rats are all over. Symbolically, these two cards are probably the least likely to be viewed as partners in any way. But inasmuch as they both represent the number 7, our arrangement of cards on a matrix allows us to view them with a fresh eye. Equidistantly, the number 7 is very similar to the number 3, but with yang to yin differences, i.e. physical, mental, material, ethereal, provocative, evocative. From the point of view of our model of existence, the number 3 dealt with the abstract concept of virtual skin around the virtual mass of a theoretical model. So, in yang to yin fashion, we find that the Chariot and Tower deal with a less tangible, more mental, ethereal, or spiritual type of skin. To the numerical tarot, we see the stars around the chariot, and the chariot itself, as symbols of beliefs, spiritual or otherwise, that contain and protect the rider within. In this way, the chariot becomes a symbol for the idea of a spiritual skin. Perhaps this image was taken from Elijah ascending to heaven, 2 Kings chapter 2 verse 11, or returning, Matthew chapter 17 verse 11, an appropriate symbol for spirituality if there ever was one. As a progression through from 1 to 9, we can see the vehicular aspects of the chariot as a symbol of spiritual transport, through the 7, to the orgasmic 8. The chariot symbolizes the successful culmination, or arrival, at this critical point by graceful and sensitive means. The chariot is a symbol for success, as opposed to that of disaster found in its partner the tower. In many decks, the chariot is drawn in such a way as to suggest that it be viewed as a power symbol, with large thundering horses careening around corners in Ben-Hur style. Still again, other people symbolize the chariot card with a warrior returning victorious, or passing by in a procession of triumphs. While others may see the rider as a representation of Aaron, Exodus chapter 28 verse 30, or maybe, Ephesians chapter 6 verse 11 or 14. Personally, I believe that these literal interpretations of a man in a chariot are missing the point of the symbolic essence of this card, that of poise, mental grace, and a symbolic connection to the divine via a theoretical skin of spirituality, as well as that of spiritual transport to the symbolic essence of the following cards of the ameliorate majors. At its best, the chariot represents a graceful transition and a sublime connection, the intellectual, yin, equivalent to the more physical, yang, grace and beauty of its equidistant partner, the Empress. At its worst, it represents a thin-skinned mind, full of fantasies and hallucinations. If illustrated by using a pre-occult deck, the idea of victory is still appropriate. In the triumphal procession of ideas that our number line attempts to represent, victory is an integral part where position 7 represents a critical point of realization or arrival, or success, which is immediately followed by eruptive euphoria, 8, and elucidation, 9. Moving on, the numerical tarot sees the Tower as yet another spiritual skin of sorts, a skin in trauma just like its equidistant partner, the Hanged Man. To me, looking at the Tower is like looking inside the Hanged Man's head. The people emerging from the Tower represent the Hanged Man's fall from grace, while the stationary aspect of the Tower opposes the idea of spiritual transport, found in the Chariot. The lightning bolt that destroys the crown symbolizes a violent outburst and the idea of disaster as opposed to the idea of success illustrated in the Chariot. These violent outbursts are what make the equidistant Hanged Man a killer. The Bible mentions towers being built on high places as something that ought not be done, 2 Kings chapter 17 verse 09. Towers are seen as proud and lofty targets of destruction, Isaiah chapter 2 verses 12 to 15. At its worst, the Tower represents violence in all forms, and the ponderous, pent-up, aberrant expressions that lead to fear, paranoia and lashing out, like a lightning bolt. It represents a destructive imagination that is connected to the evil of the preceding devil, as well as the danger, darkness and death of the Deteriorate Major's final 2 cards. At its best, it represents the comforts of sticking to reality and literal expression. Like the Chariot, the Tower is also an acceptable symbol from decks of old, that appropriately describes the triumphal procession of ideas being described by our number line. The difference being that instead of symbolizing a point of successful arrival, it symbolizes a disastrous point of no return, that is followed immediately by dysphoria, 8, and termination, 9. In the seasonal tarot deck, we see a man meditating near the top of a mountain. A rose in a wreath of victory, opposed by a man looking crucified with blood oozing. A tower being struck by lightning. In the isomorphic tarot deck, I symbolize my own subjective sense of a bad, negative, deteriorate 7 of the majors with a violent image of a public stoning. Such desecration can then be taken 2 ways, as either an expression of violent hatred by others upon a hapless victim, or of a wretched, despicable person deserving such crucifixion. Either way, the violent, aggravated, aberrant connection to evil is enforced. I title the card Desecration, the Wretched Heathen. On the other side, I choose to contrast this image with the image of a consecrated guru elevated in sublime meditation and surrounded by loving gifts of flowers, instead of tortured by hurled stones. His chariot is now reduced to that of a magic carpet, maintaining the idea of spiritual transport, while the stake that our wretched heathen is tied to becomes the stationary tower of disaster, and a symbol for adherence to reality. I title this card Consecration, the Blessed Guru. In the numerical tarot deck, we see a Krishna-looking saint playing a flute. We see the hand of a virtuist in meditation. Behind is the chariot of spiritual transport. In the distance is a house on a hill covered in rays of inspiring light emerging from clouds. We see a bird of paradise. He is opposed by a dominatrix-looking sadist with a whip in her mouth and a blood-stained sword in her hand. We see the hand of a crucified sinner. In the distance is a tower being struck by lightning, and 3 crosses. There is blood everywhere. We see a Venus flytrap, waiting for a meal. The key word to remember for both of these cards is energy. You will recall that in the cosmic engine analogy, energy and space displaced became the products of consumed time and motion, thus leading all 1 through 9 progressions to an explosive end at the number 8. On the positive ameliorate side of the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, we see the consistent, ascending energy of the Strength card, while on the negative deteriorate side we have the distant fading energy of the Star. Both these cards represent the energy of the explosive 8, but in ameliorate and deteriorate ways. Over the head of the woman in the Strength card is a figure known as a cosmic lemniscant. It symbolizes the flux of energy, and its connection to motion, time and space, in Mobius-like fashion. The idea of a woman holding open the mouth of a lion symbolizes the magnitude of the energy involved. In early decks, the card of Strength was seen more often in position 11, currently held in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck by Justice. In the Rider-Waite deck, these cards of Justice and Strength were swapped. One theory for why comes from astrology, and the idea that when aligning the major icons with the zodiac, the sign of Libra comes closest to position 11, and the sign of Leo comes closest to position 8. When such an association is made, it reinforces the idea being presented here, that this is a card of energy, solar energy. Leo is the sign of summer sun. This is a card of that kind of solar energy and activity. The fact that the lion does not appear to be struggling is an indication that this strength of energy is spiritual as well as physical, enabling the woman's spiritual powers of concentration to dominate, or be one with, the spirit of the lion. It's possible that the idea of a woman dominating the spirit of a lion came from the biblical image of angels protecting Daniel after being locked in a pit full of lions, Daniel chapter 6 verse 12. Or perhaps the image was an adaptation of Samson tearing apart a lion on his way to Timnath, Judges 14.5-6, where the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him. This kind of sudden burst of enormous energy, like an adrenaline rush, is a good symbol for this position, although the impetuous nature of Samson's act might put its goodness in question. That of course is subjective. At best, the card of strength represents a consistent repetition of orgasmic, explosive conclusions that result in an even flow of life-giving energy, culminating energy. At its worst, it represents the hyperactivity of an overdose, like too much caffeine. As we speak of sudden bursts of energy, we move on to the star card, which represents, to the numerical tarot, the final burst of energy phenomenon seen in the progression of all dying entities. This final exhaustion of energy is symbolized by the deliberate and direct pouring of water from the vessels held in the woman's hands. Pouring onto land and water includes physical as well as mental exhaustion. While her naked body symbolizes the waste of energy that occurs on a cold night without cover. The ibis in the background is symbolic of Thoth, who recorded the souls of the dead, thus confirming that we are following a progression of cards devoted to a progression toward death. Sometimes the star card is labeled hope, because of the sudden return to life that occurs during the burst of energy phenomenon of dying entities. At best, this card can be thought of that way, the final burst of energy that puts you over the top. At its worst, it symbolizes wasted energy, no hope, and the depression and helplessness that goes with it, i.e., terminating energy. Perhaps, even though it is usually illustrated with a naked woman, we could still equate this image with the hardships of Job, Job 30-16. As a symbol of hope, we can observe how a sense of hope usually comes in tandem with a sense of desperation and hopelessness. In the numerical tarot deck, with its parallel 9 path of majors, we can see this tandem idea of hope and desperation by imagining that the star we see in the night sky of the star card is the energy of the parallel partnered 8 that we place on the positive side of our parallel layout, i.e. the strength card. Only, in this case, seen from a distance. At night. In this way, the star card literally represents a faint glimmer of hope, as the energy of the positive 8, strength, is seen from afar, at night. So it is that on this negative path of darkness, we look to the positive energy of an 8 that is full of life. That 8 is the card of strength. At a distance. At night. Is it too far away? Is it a faint glimmer or still viable enough to offer hope? In the seasonal tarot deck, we see a woman dressed like a dancer in an energetic pose. Hourglass resembling the exiting force of the funnel tunnel maze diagram. Opposed by a blindfolded woman in the dark. Vessel pouring out life. In the isomorphic tarot deck, the naked woman of the star card is seen pouring her vessels out, while the hand of a death figure blinds her eyes, to symbolize the dark and confined space of this negative deteriorate position. This death figure is also seen, pulling from the woman's chest, a symbol of her last ounce of energy, squeezing it dry like a sponge in front of her, symbolizing the terminating energy, desperation and hopelessness of a bad negative 8. I title the card Desperation, the hopeless sickling. On the other side, I symbolize the strength card with an elated dancer in a diaphanous gown, being lifted from a panoramic mountaintop by a radiant spiritual image of herself. Her dancing symbolizes the energy of this position, while the panoramic view symbolizes the idea of open space. The diaphanous gown and lifting off into the heavens symbolizes the light and airy feelings of climactic, culminating energy. I title my ameliorate positive 8 exhilaration, the enlightened enthusiast. In the numerical tarot deck, we see a spry-looking lumina, spreading angel dust in the air. We see the hand of a Vivian with a cup that runneth over with bubbling enthusiasm. Fish are turning into birds that fly away. In the distance, kites are flying. We see a dragonfly fluttering about like a tiny sprite. She is opposed by a wraith who is squeezing the last drop of life out of a star in the night sky. She has a snake with poisonous fangs for a head. There are snakes on the ground. We see the hand of a sickling pouring out the last drops of life. A snake is waiting to bite with poison. To me, these two cards each represent endings that are of course not really endings at all. The Hermit is an old wise man at the top of a mountain. When seen within the context of the underlying system being presented in this study, he is the equidistant opposite to the Magician, a young man, just starting out at the bottom of the mountain. Together these two icons symbolically represent the idea of point, young, small, and sphere, old, expansive, as seen in the geometric progression video. The symbol of a hermit reinforces the concept of isolation found in the number 9 position of the apart together model, as well as the culmination of positive forces to a zenith, and the establishment of a conclusive, fruitful, multifarious totality. The hermit represents a consummate wealth of knowledge resulting from successive culminations of the endless cycle that is the number line. At his best he knows everything. At his worst he is a know-it-all, and obsessed with reaching goals, a megalomaniac. The moon on the other hand, represents an ending of another kind. Whereas the death card may have implied literal death to many, to the numerical tarot, the moon is now seen as the real card of actual death. The two pillars in the distance represent the Pillars of Hercules, also known as the Straits of Gibraltar, beyond which was believed to be the end of the world, a limit no one could pass. Certain death. To the numerical tarot, the moon, and the pathway that leads to it, represent the passing of life, back, into the vacuous nothingness that surrounds us all. The wolves or dogs are baying at the moon to symbolize the loneliness of isolation found in the number 9 position. Some say the dogs belong to Diana, a goddess with associations to the moon. Sometimes the dogs are black and white, suggesting both new and full moons. But the full moon is usually considered the more impressive of those two, as it punches a hole into the night sky, creating a portal to the great beyond for souls to pass through. When a full moon is seen low on the horizon, across a body of water, the reflection of light casts a pathway to the moon, not unlike the road often depicted in this card. The crab emerging from the water is an astrological association that can also be seen as a representation of how powerful the moon is at influencing the behavior of life on Earth, as changes in the tides affect the life cycles of animals in water as well as humans on land. As this influence is acknowledged, we see how lunacy becomes an appropriate symbol for a bad, negative, deteriorate 9. At its worst, the moon means death, fear of death, or fear of the dark and the unknown. It means an abrupt and arresting conclusion that is futile and abysmal in perpetuity. At its best it means a conclusion that leaves you with nothing, no harm done, a clean slate, acceptance of the changes dictated by the preceding death card, closure. In the seasonal tarot deck, we see a man dressed like a monk with a glowing yellow sun-like orb at top of mountain. Lantern of Hermit, opposed by a robed woman with moon-like white-colored orb and black dog and black bird in background. Skull and crossed bones with moon. In the isomorphic tarot deck, the image of a hermit remains intact and is illustrated with an elderly man being led up into heaven by a group of beckoning angels, via a Jacob's ladder type of device. I title the card Zenith, the consummate sage. On the other side, the image of the moon on the horizon, seen as a symbol of death's portal, remains intact. And, because I choose to illustrate my own subjective sense of the bad side of negative deteriorative cards, I illustrate an undignified death, into the depths of hell, with a rotting corpse. I title the card Nadir, the desolate corpse. In the numerical tarot deck, we see a god beckoning to heaven via a stairway. We see the hand of a sage striving to reach the sun. Books of knowledge are on the ground. There is a pot of gold and rainbow. He is opposed by a ghoul pointing to a grave. We see the hand of a corpse sinking into the grave. Skulls of death are on the ground. There is a pot of ashes. Bats from hell are flying around, creating confusion. Okay. Obviously, this video has gotten way too long. I would be surprised if anyone at all has watched this to the end. If you have, thanks for the interest. We will have to finish this analysis with a second video for the minor suits. But in a brief conclusion to this video, let's review or take a guess at which cards in the numerical tarot are similar enough to the Rider-Waite-Smith deck as to be acceptable, versus cards that are so different as to most probably be rejected by devotees of the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, or mainstream tarot in general, as wrong. In these major icons, People will probably not like the removal of the High Priestess. They will not like changing the wheel to a jinx and including a fool or idiot, meaning no actual fool card anymore. They will not like changing justice into a haunt. They will not like changing temperance into a witch. They will not like taking all hope out of the star card, or out of the moon card and making that a card of death. They will not like changing the fool into part of the quaternary, an idea that is discussed in another video. With that I will say goodbye and hope you watch part 2. That's all for this video. Thanks for watching. Hope it made sense. Links to ebooks, decks and merchandise below. And if anyone is interested in drawing a deck based on this system of organization, don't hesitate to contact me for a collaboration.